Greetings, everyone. Hope everybody's having a great fall day wherever you are. I know the weather throughout most of North Carolina is pretty crisp and cool today. So I appreciate you taking time out of your lunch hour to participate today in Know Before You Vote, a pre-election advocacy information webinar. I am Robert Broome. I'm the Director of Advocacy for NCACPA. Been with the organization for about 4 years, and this is certainly one of my favorite topics to discuss. And joining me today is my good friend and colleague, Iris Laws from the firm Forvis Mazars. I've had the pleasure of knowing Iris for, gosh, Iris, what, about 3 years?
Yeah, it's about right now. Yep.
Iris first came down here, came to North Carolina by way of Virginia, where she was very active with the Virginia Society of CPAs. And at NCACPA, she just jumped right in, getting involved with our advocacy resource group, has been a fantastic contributor to that group, and as we've formulated policy and responded to legislative requests and attended legislative events and things like that, raised money for the CPA Political Action Committee, but then also has been very involved in the Young Professionals Cabinet as a young and emerging leader of NCACPA, and look forward to our conversation today. And Iris, I'm excited about working with you and the other folks that are on this Zoom call today as we move forward. Anything you'd like to add?
No, likewise. Just thank you for the kind introduction. I'm so excited to be chatting with you guys today. Robert has all of us in good hands. I'm just here for some color commentary, maybe. So excited about today. And yeah, if you have any questions, I'll be monitoring the chat.
Thank you, Iris. And again, want to reiterate that today's session is unfortunately not for CPE credit, but we do want this to be a participatory event. So again, if you have questions, throw them up in the chat box, and Iris and I will be monitoring those as we go along. So why don't we jump right into it? Ready to roll, Iris?
Let's do it.
Awesome. All right, so I just want to level set very quickly for just a moment about what we're going to be talking about today. I'm going to be sharing a lot of information about polling and polling results and things like that. But I want to be clear, except for maybe a couple of exceptions, and I'll note those, we're not making any predictions today about the election or what's going to happen on November 5th or the days following. I love this Yogi Berra quote about how it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future, and it's doubly so for predictions about elections. But let's get into it. So the map you see on your screen here is this is this is an electoral college map, and certainly don't want to bore anybody with a Civics 101 course here, but just a quick reminder that although Vice President Harris currently enjoys about a 2.5% lead in national polls, that's not how we elect presidents in this country. We do that through something called the Electoral College. And I could probably spend a whole hour just debating the merits or demerits of the Electoral College system, but for better or worse, it's the system we've got. And you need 270 electoral votes to win a presidential election. And right now, this is shaping up to be what could be the closest electoral college contest maybe ever in the U.S. The only time I think it's ever really been closer than this is when it was tied once. I believe that was the election of 1848. So it's been a minute since we've had to deal with that in the U.S. But looking at the electoral map here, I want to call your attention to these kind of, I don't know, tan or taupe colored states. Those are the 7 states, often thought of or referred to as battleground states, or what I call toss-up states here. And it's really what's going to happen in these 7 states is going to determine the outcome of the election on November 5th. And so let's spend just a moment taking a little bit of a deeper dive or closer look at those 7 toss-up states and what's going on with polling. So got listed here. These are 4 of the most popular, what I like to call poll aggregator sites. And the way these sites work is they create moving polling averages based on a variety of state and national polls using various methodologies and statistical techniques to weight and adjust polls to create this rolling polling average or moving polling average. And so each of their methodologies, like I said, they vary from system to system. We've got here 270 to win. We've also got Real Clear Politics, 538, which is originally started by Nate Silver, now run by ABC News. And then finally, the last one is called Split Ticket. And they're all looking at different polls, and none of these obviously are exactly alike, but there is some tremendous similarity with where things stand in these races. The couple of interesting takeaways from this is I did a similar presentation to what we're talking about today last week, or I guess a week and a half ago at NC State, and had a similar slide here. And what's been interesting is the race has tightened even further since October or September 30th, I guess, is when I was over there. And just a couple of interesting things here too is that all of these averages, these moving polling averages that you see demonstrated here, of course, are all within the margin of error. And so to say that this race is close is really such a ridiculous understatement. So a couple of interesting things about what's going on in these 7 states. Of course, North Carolina, we're in the thick of it. If you're watching television, you're seeing a lot of ads. According to Ad Impact, which is an advertising analytics firm that tracks political advertising, Democrats have spent about $1.1 billion on television ads, along with future reservations, since Vice President Harris announced her candidacy back in July. At the same time, Republicans have spent about $400 million. So pretty big disparity there in terms of ad spend and ad reserves. In the 7 swing states alone, more than $1 billion has been spent on presidential campaign ads, with 88% of all ad spend through Election Day. And so a lot of money flowing out there, and certainly a tightening and narrowing race there. So let's take a closer look at North Carolina. Some interesting things here, and this is from Real Clear Politics. I like how they do their data visualization. Here, prior to Biden dropping out of the race on July 21st, Trump had a really comfortable margin of in terms of polling. He was outside the margin of error, was typically ahead by anywhere from 6 to 7 points. And as you can see here, Harris entering the race just closed that gap in nothing flat. And again, statistically, it is a tie right now, with just a slightly favoring, and again in these moving polling averages, slightly favoring former President Trump, but certainly shaping up to be, if these numbers hold, the closest presidential election in North Carolina history. So forgive me, Iris, any questions or anything like that so far?
Not yet, but keep them coming, folks.
Awesome. And feel free to jump in if you've got observations.
For sure.
Again, talking about this, talking about ad spend and things like that, there's all kinds of ways that myself and my fellow politicos, tend to evaluate these a campaign's health or a campaign's level of activity. Harris, as I said earlier, is certainly outspending Trump on television. But what's interesting, it's nothing compared to the way that Democrats are outspending Republicans on digital advertising. And so I saw a report from the Wesleyan Media Project last week that found that Harris is outspending Trump on Meta platforms. So think, Facebook, Instagram, Threads. She's outspending Trump on Meta platforms 16-1, and on Google at about a 3-1 clip. So a massive amount of spend there. She also has a spending advantage on radio, where that's being tracked. And as you can see here with these numbers in North Carolina, this data is about 2 weeks old, but I think it still holds in terms of ad spend and ad reserves, and what we can expect to see between now and Election Day. Pretty sizable advantage for the Harris campaign, just in terms of dollars raised, cash on hand. But again, that big ad spend and reserve. And bear in mind too, this also includes spending from super PACs or Section 527 organizations that are acting independently of either of these campaigns. So a lot of ad spend going on in North Carolina. And I don't know about you. I'm personally, man, I'm sick of the political advertising, but we've got about a 3-week gauntlet to run between now and Election Day. So shifting gears here a little bit, this map here is the U.S. Senate map. And what we're looking at here, the Senate has right now 51 Democrats or that caucus together, or I should say a caucus of 51 individuals. 3 of those are independents that caucus with the Democrats. And they've got that 2-seat majority, 51-49 Republicans. There are 34 seats up for election in 2024 in the U.S. Senate, including a special election in Nebraska, of which 23 are held by the Democrats or independents. So Democrats and independents playing a lot of defense here. Republicans can retake control of the Senate with a net gain of 2 seats, or by winning the presidential election along with a net gain of 1 seat. This is, all due respect to my Yogi Berra quote earlier, this is something where I feel pretty comfortable making a prediction here. The Republicans are going to retake control of the Senate, barring some sort of massive October surprise in the Montana Senate race. I think John Tester is headed toward defeat there. He's done I think by all accounts, a great job representing that state in the Senate, but I think the electoral math is just finally going to catch up with him. The big question mark right now is the state of Ohio, where to get reelected to the Senate. Last polling I saw on that had him up somewhere about 2 points, but still, within the margin of error on rolling polling averages. How
You're
much
back. We made it through talking about Tester a little bit.
Oh, okay. So let me back up. All right. So what I was saying there with the Senate race.
I do think you need to share your little slides again, though.
Oh, okay. What in the world happened there? 1 second, y'all. All right. One more time.
Perfect. There we go.
All right, back in business. So as I was saying, John Tester's in a tight race in Montana, and Sherrod Brown is, I'm sorry, let me back up. West Virginia almost certainly is going to go from a Democrat to a Republican-held seat with the retirement of Joe Manchin. The big question mark is what's going to happen in Ohio, where Sherrod Brown is running for re-election. Last polling I saw, rolling polling average, had him at up by about 2.5 points. And that's still, of course, within the margin. So that's going to be one to watch on election night. But again, I think it's a virtual certainty that that Republicans are going to control the Senate when Congress comes back in January. So moving ahead, looking at the House, takes 218 votes to control the House. And right now, the GOP currently holds 220 seats. So it's an incredibly narrow margin of control there, and we've seen some of the unfortunate effects of a razor-thin margin like that with some of the things like running up on government shutdowns or potential government shutdowns. We've seen a speaker get replaced in the middle of a Congress when Kevin McCarthy was ousted by the GOP caucus. And it's also made it incredibly difficult to pass meaningful legislation. And it's required Republicans to reach across the aisle, make concessions to Democrats, just so they can get the 218 votes needed to pass legislation. So like I said, GOP holds 220 seats currently. Democrats have 212. There are 3 vacancies right now. 2 of those were caused by deaths of Democratic incumbents and 1 Republican resignation. Now, looking at this map, if you notice that number at the top of the screen, again, that sort of taupe color there are currently 22 races that are currently rated as toss-ups by various political handicappers. These are districts where the incumbent does not represent the party of the presidential candidate that carried the district 4 years ago. So those are the swing districts. And what most folks are saying right now, and myself included, is that the House control is probably going to come down to a handful of suburban districts in New York and New Jersey and perhaps elsewhere, where the state and local tax deduction cap has played a huge and I would say even outsized role in those elections. And we'll talk more about that as Iris gets into the provisions of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act and what's up for renewal next year. But like I said, I think House control rolls squarely through those suburban districts. But we've got one of those districts here in North Carolina. It's the 1st district in Northeast North Carolina. Don Davis is a first-term incumbent Democrat. He's being challenged by Lori Buckout, retired U.S. Army colonel. And as you can see on the screen here, Congressman Davis enjoys a pretty sizable fundraising advantage. This is what we call a D+2 district. That number comes from the Cook Political Report. They have this thing that they developed that's really outstanding called the Partisan Voter Index, where they score each district as compared to the nation as a whole. A Cook PVI score of D+2 in this district means that in 2016 and 2020 presidential elections, that district performed an average of 2 points more Democratic than the rest of the nation did as a whole. So slight advantage here toward the Democrats, but this district was specifically drawn by Republicans in the state legislature to be the most competitive district in the upcoming congressional election when they redistricted again, or redistricted in 2021, then redistricted again in 2023. So certainly a race to watch on election night. So thinking about all of these races and what's at stake, we've got a presidential election that by the polling certainly looks too close to call at this point. It's anybody's ball game. We've got North Carolina playing a central role in that. And we've got what's looking like going to be a Republican Senate and a House control that most folks are saying that Democrats probably have a better chance of regaining control of the House than the Republicans do of maintaining control. Well, what does that mean going forward at the federal level? And one of the things that I think is, again, a virtual certainty is that no matter who controls the White House or controls the 2 chambers of Congress next year, There is a fight coming. In fact, I love this quote about it being called the Super Bowl of tax, and to guide us through what's on the line and what we can expect and why this election is so important. I'm going to turn things over to Iris. So, Iris, take it away.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks. No, certainly, I think that is an adequate description of what we're looking at to next year. So if we can go ahead and flip to the next slide, Robert. So I know not everyone on this call are tax nerds like myself. So to step back a little bit, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed in 2017. At the time, Trump was president. And basically, there were some taxpayer, quote, favorable provisions in there, meaning reduced tax for most taxpayers, and some taxpayer costly provisions in there. And so, it's always a game, right, of balancing revenue raisers versus tax cuts. So there's some offsetting considerations there, like there will inevitably be in 2025. And so I think, obviously, at that time, there were mostly, if you just look at quantity wise, there were probably more in number of individually of changes that affect individual taxpayers, right? So we're looking at things like the top tax rate, AMT, standard deduction, child tax credit, all of those good things that you can see on this slide. But there was arguably more impactful changes to the business side of things. So, I mean, we hadn't even had the concept of beat or guilty or fitty until 2017, right? So those concepts were introduced, as well as some general business impacts for domestic taxpayers. The 199A deduction, again, for those who aren't tax people necessarily, is a deduction that affects owners of businesses, whether they're investments or they have their own businesses. It's a 20% deduction that people have grown very used to. It was passed because the corporate tax rate was lowered as a result of TCJA, and they didn't want people to just all of a sudden jump ship on all of their flow-through entities to become C corps. And so this was kind of their change to affect that. There's also ERC, or not ERC, I'm sorry. 174 was the one that I wanted to mention, which is the capitalization of R&D costs. And that one has actually been in a 2024 bill proposal that is basically dead. It still may pass in the lame duck session following the election, but at this point, there haven't been moves to progress it further. It did pass the House and then stalled in the Senate. So at this point, we're looking at a 174 capitalization consideration that would happen in 2025 is what it's looking like mostly. As Robert mentioned, the SALT cap is something that has been very influential on the individual side of things from TCJA. It's one of those costly measures, right, that they implemented to be able to fund some of the more favorable changes. We'll see what happens there. I think with TCJA specifically, and we'll get to this in a little bit, but both parties have some consideration of, hey, we really want to extend at least part of this, at least for some taxpayers. The question is really to what extent. So here's just sort of some side-by-side overview of that. All right, next slide, Robert, if you could. Perfect. So what does it look like? What are the two sort of considerations of why not just extend it if it's helped people, right? The big issue here is that it's been scored for a full extension at $4 trillion if we were to fully extend TCJA. And that value does include both revenue raisers as well as the costs. So if we were to take out, like, let's say they don't extend the SALT cap, for example, that number would be higher. That also does not include any sort of additional proposals that Republicans and Trump have since included in their party platforms. So it's all part of a scoring game at this point. Why does that matter? We're looking at an economic background to this country where we have a deficit and interest and national debt with interest that is soon to be, outspending the GDP by 200%. So we're really looking at to what extent in 2025 are legislators going to be considering the deficit, revenue raisers, and the incursion of national debt. So that's one side. The other side, though, if we don't extend TCJA, what does that mean? There's a helpful little calculator. There's some versions of this out on the website, on the internet. But according to the Tax Foundation's little calculator, if you are a person who is single with no dependents, makes 100K, if no extenders were made and TCJA was just meant to phase out as it is planned to by the end of 2025, then you would owe an additional $2,600-ish. And so that's just a little like test case. Obviously, the higher income you get, the more impactful this will be. But again, it will theoretically, if nothing is done, no action is taken, will increase the tax burden on individuals.
An important caveat there, though, Iris, is that if they don't extend the TCJA, and yes, these taxes will go up, we won't have the corresponding $4 trillion addition to the deficit, correct?
Correct. However, depending on who is president and who has control of the House and the Congress just in general, there could be a price tag to other things that people want to do. So it's all a game of give and take there with with the spending. All right. So I did think it would be interesting to kind of compare the two platforms of the presidential candidates. They are different in a lot of ways, but there are some topics that they do overlap on. So I thought it would be important to highlight both. The first is the corporate tax rate. So Trump has put out that he would be in favor of lowering the corporate tax rate from 21% to 20%. And Harris is in favor of that being up to 28%. There was some, jabber in the news early on that she would be in favor of a 35% rate, but since then she has come back down to a 28% rate. She's also put out that a capital gains tax she would be in favor of at a 28% rate. So the IRA, or the Inflation Reduction Act, is primarily targeted at clean energy tax credits. And, Harris has come out and been very in favor of clean energy credits in that movement. Trump has been less so. He has been primarily vocal about electric vehicle and fuel incentives. So I did want to sort of highlight, right, like the clean energy tax credits are not new with the IRA. There are some that have been around for longer. And so the likelihood that there would be a complete repeal of all clean energy credits, I can't say that I would believe that necessarily, but what I could see is pieces of the IRA may get repealed, again, in order to, balance that budget as it would be. So there is some overlap though. TCJA, again, this is the big thing that we're going to be talking about all through 2025. Trump is basically saying, let's extend it. We like it. It's my bill, right? And then Harris is saying, why don't we just extend it for those making under $400,000 so that their income tax is not affected? So to what extent that these things are extended is really going to be up to the congressional math and how that plays out with the election. I think it's been well circulated in the news about the proposal to exempt tips, and Trump has gone on to say that he would also exempt overtime wages and Social Security. We've have contacts on the Hill that have said That's really going to be an uphill battle. We'll see what happens there. All of this, we're playing a little bit of a game of what is realistic given the economic environment. And again, the congressional math of where things play out to what is really more of a campaign trail messaging kind of proposal. So tariffs is another thing that we've heard a lot about. Trump has proposed a 10% baseline on all goods and a 60% tariff on Chinese goods. And he has sort of posed that as his way to pay for some of that 4 trillion. What's interesting is that tariffs are not scored and considered with the TCJA extenders or that $4 trillion number. So even if this were to happen, that $4 trillion number necessarily wouldn't change. But Robert, you came off mute. Would you like to chat about that?
Well, I was just going to say, I think an important part of that, and not to get too far into the weeds here, but when it comes to passage of tax policy in a Congress that's going to be this closely divided, it's almost certainly going to have to be done through the budget reconciliation process. And I don't know if you were going to say anything about that, Iris.
Go for it.
But the thing about the budget reconciliation process is that the scoring and the ability to run that bill, especially through on the Senate side, where you can avoid a cloture vote, that is where you have to have 60 votes in order to cease debate and call for a vote on a bill. That the important thing there is that to qualify for that budget reconciliation process to pass a bill, there are restrictions on how much a bill can add to the deficit, which is part and parcel of why these TCJA provisions are expiring in 2025. Is that was the only way that Republicans could use the budget reconciliation legislative process to pass the TCJA in the first place, is if they put a sunset on it that wouldn't trigger the deficit restrictions. And so the pay for in all of this in terms of extending TCJA provisions, I think becomes terrifically important. Just from a legislative management point of view, and I'm sorry, I know this is very wonky, but the whole thing about the tariffs to bring in additional revenue as an impact on tax policy, I think that it's not getting enough play in the media about how important that is.
Yep. So, and to your point, reconciliation, TCJA was passed with reconciliation, the IRA was passed with reconciliation.
Yes.
And so the most recent impactful sweeping sort of bills were passed with that measure. That being said, again, the math of how that worked out is that was possible. And so we're really going to have to see how the congressional election plays out and to see what might be even possible next year. So all that being said, I think, we've touched on some of the different platforms. Harris has come out with different things as well, specifically targeted towards sort of smaller businesses, things like a $50,000 startup expense deduction from $5,000, and a focus on small businesses in rural areas as well. Great. So I think we hear a lot about presidential candidates in the news. We don't necessarily hear a lot about vice presidential candidates in the news. So did think it could be kind of fun to spend a little bit of time on the tax background of these two VP candidates. J.D. Vance and Tim Walz have vastly different records when it comes to participation in tax legislation. Vance has less involvement, whereas Tim Walz has been involved in over 200 tax bills. So there's a lot more to pull from the Tim Walz side of things than the J.D. Vance side of things. Recently, J.D. Vance has been involved in favor of a excise tax on an endowment, on endowments for educational institutions, and that would go from raising that excise tax from a 1.4% to a 35%. So that's a fairly substantial increase. He's also been, I believe, a co-sponsor on a bill targeting corporate mergers for those, corporations that earn over $500 million of revenue. So those are two sort of just like recent notable things that he's been a part of. Tim Walz, on the other hand, has voted against TCJA in the past. So, along party lines in that way. However, he has broken from his party, or the majority of how his party is voting on things in the past. So things like the George W. Bush tax cuts and certain individual related bills while he was governor. All right, so we talked about this a little bit and we've kind of alluded to it, but there's really three potential outcomes, right? There's what we call a Republican sweep. So the president is a Republican. The House, and all of both houses of Congress are, House and Senate are Republican. There's a divided government, meaning one of those three entities are a different party than the other, or there's a Democratic sweep. So everyone's a Democrat. The different sort of big buckets that we're going to be looking at when we're considering 2025 legislation are up on the screen. So TCJ extenders are probably the biggest. The child's tax credit is sort of a unique one. It was primarily responsible for the failure of the 2024 tax bill that was proposed and passed the House. It's going to be an interesting one to see how they make that a part of deliberations in 2025. And then business priorities. So the big three is what I like to call this last row. And this is primarily that 2024 bill that I'm referring to. It's 174 capitalization, which again is R&D costs. Instead of immediately expensing them, we're forced to capitalize them. So you're getting that benefit over time instead of immediately. 100% bonus depreciation. So bonus depreciation, meaning you get that depreciation expense in the first year. That's been phasing out and will officially phase out in 2026. And then a change in how 163J is calculated. So 163J was implemented in with TCJA as well, and it was basically a potential for limiting interest. So they were trying to promote proper leveraging of companies by implementing 163J. So basically, how would that play out in the different scenarios? I think when you look at TCJA, Republicans are going to be pretty much across the board in favor of extension, while Democrats would be in favor to a certain extent. Right now, again, Harris has promoted that 400K threshold. Whether that changes or not is largely going to be due to dependent on congressional math, which is where that divided government column plays out. The child tax credit. So Harris has come out in favor of a increased child tax credit, making it permanent, and then providing a $6,000 credit for newborns. That, it made it through the House, not that particular proposal, but an extension to some extent of the child tax credit made it through the House in the 2024 bill. And so the question is going to be, does that play into some of the compromises that Democrats and Republicans may have to make if it were a divided government? Republicans have voiced some concerns over the child tax credit proposals to date. And again, that is largely the primary reason why the 2024 bill did not pass the Senate this time. So we'll see what happens there. For the business priorities we talked about, I think those the big three that we talked about are very bipartisan favored. And so I would not be surprised to see them incorporated in some form or fashion into some sort of omnibus bill that gets proposed in 2025. I do think that funding is going to be a big deal when it comes to what's included in these proposals and what's not. And then Democrats are going to be focusing mostly on small businesses and affordable housing.
Awesome. Thank you, Iris.
Yeah, thank you. Any
All
questions?
right.
I don't see any questions come up.
Nothing popping up in the chat.
Okay.
Quiet group today. I have to say I'm a little surprised, maybe a tinge disappointed. Come on, hit us with some questions. But while folks are mulling what to ask, want to highlight just a couple of other quick federal issues, and then maybe shift our attention back to being some North Carolina focus. Some things I've thrown up here on the screen. Just these are other issues that have been hot topics lately. I think could potentially be items for consideration or have impact in 2025 and beyond. First, the Federal Trade Commission ban on non-compete agreements that came out this past year. Widely getting rid or proposing to get rid of those. That is now a matter before the courts. The plaintiffs sued the FTC and got injunctive relief. So that ban on non-compete agreements has not gone into effect. It's there's an injunction against that, and so it may be years before this makes its way to the Supreme Court for final adjudication. But it's just something to keep an eye on. Speaking of the Supreme Court, there were two really big, important decisions in this past term that I think could have some significant impact moving ahead. A lot of question marks about how extensive that's going to be, but those two decisions were the first one was Loper-Bright. That's where the Supreme Court overruled the longstanding Chevron doctrine. And what the Chevron doctrine did was to grant latitude to federal agencies to interpret the statutes that they administer in dispute cases. And so the ruling in Loper-Bright is a pretty monumental shift, or I should say, it's the potential for a monumental shift in power to the courts, as opposed to the executive agencies in the interpretation and implementation of law. And of course, we're keeping a close eye on that in terms of the IRS. And I think what we'll see on the congressional side is Congress is going to need to be a lot more specific and a lot less vague when it comes to rulemaking authority that they grant and things like that. The other case of note was the Supreme Court decision in Corner Post, and what that decision did was it clarified the time frame that a party can sue an agency under the Administrative Procedures Act for harm caused by that agency's regulations. And essentially what it did was it completely upended the statute of limitations by significantly extending the time frame to be 6 years from when the party is injured, as opposed to the previous doctrine, which had been 6 years from when the ruling was issued. And so that's creating this sort of rolling statute of limitations depending on when injury occurs from an agency's ruling or interpretation. I think opens up a lot of federal rules to challenges as new businesses enter a particular regulated space. So again, something that we'll be keeping a close eye on. Another thing, and this impacts CPAs, not just in those in public accounting practice, but also those in business and industry where they might have beneficial ownership information reporting requirements, or BOI reporting requirements. That is the anti-money laundering rule that went into effect under the Corporate Transparency Act. Basically, what it comes down to is that there are about 32.6 million small businesses in the U.S. that are going to have to file a beneficial ownership information report by January 1st. So far, only about 4.5 million have actually completed that filing. And a lot of those businesses are unsure of well, one, I think they're ignorant of the reporting requirement, but then two, not sure where to turn. Do they go to their CPA? Do they go to their attorney? And there's a lot of risk associated with CPA firms providing that service. And we've got a lot of continuing professional education offered by NCACPA about this topic. And if you think you might be want to be involved in that or have more questions about that, I encourage you to check that out or hit me up after this with your questions. And then finally, of course, is the processing of employee retention credit claims. And as Iris alluded to earlier, there was the tax bill, the Wyden-Smith tax bill that passed the House earlier this year. One of the significant pay-fors of some of the favorable tax provisions included in that bill was getting rid of the employee retention credit, sunsetting it back at the beginning of this year. Of course, now all that has changed because that bill did not pass in the Senate, but could be up for consideration in late November or early December when Congress comes back for a lame duck session. Anything you want to add there, Iris?
Yeah, I was just going to say ERC is a funny one when we talk about funding because initially, yes, that is how it was proposed, is this is our funding for the 2024 bill. And then there was a lot of discussion of, hey, is that really the case? Like, should this really be considered true, quote, funding for it? So that's going to be a question. Also, that January 31st cutoff date. A lot of what we're hearing from the Hill is that will still be implemented. So regardless of when something passes, that January 31 date will still be in play. So how that plays a part again into the funding discussion is really to be seen.
So let's shift gears and talk a little bit more about North Carolina. So tomorrow is the beginning of early voting in North Carolina, and that'll run from now until the Saturday before Election Day. And I want to talk a little bit about some of the races that are on the ballot and some implications of the election on state issues. But first, before we get into those races, I want to talk just a little bit about North Carolina's recent political history and the changing political landscape. And the slide that you see here, this was Roy Cooper's first statewide victory in 2000 when he ran for Attorney General. And he won that race with 51% of the vote. And what's interesting here is that Cooper carried 63 counties in 2000. And again, won that race by less than 5 points. So that was 24 years ago, and you can see a lot of blue on this map. So again, carried it with 63 counties. Flash forward to 2020 when he ran for re-election as governor, roughly the same margin of victory, not quite 5 points. But what was interesting is that he needed only 28 counties to carry that election in North Carolina. And so, of course, the thing is, counties don't vote, people do. The big takeaway here is that what I like to call the urbanization of the Democratic Party, you can inverse that, the ruralification, if I can turn that into a word, of the Republican Party, and the interplay essentially between partisan preference and geography really cannot be overstated how important that is to how elections are run and how elections are won in North Carolina. And so this final slide I want to show here about the political landscape is where there are more voters today than there were 20 or 24 years ago. And you can see where those population shifts are occurring. A lot of our rural counties are actually shrinking in population. All of our urban counties and suburban and exurban counties are growing in population. And again, that's where we're seeing this sort of calcification of Republican and Democratic preference. Kind of another fun, interesting fact here about North Carolina's evolving political landscape. Anybody want to take a guess in the chat about which party makes up the largest chunk of registered voters in North Carolina? Well, nobody's taking a guess. I tell you what, Iris, I'm going to put you on the spot. Want to take a guess? Which party makes up the larger chunk of registered voters?
I'm gonna say I'm gonna get in trouble. I'm not gonna answer that. I
Okay,
don't
well,
want to be
we are seeing
biased
some stuff
towards
come in on the chat.
I
We
don't
are
want to
seeing
be
some,
biased towards my state here.
well, so, we're getting all kinds of guesses, Republicans, Democrat, but it's independents, or technically what is in North Carolina election parlance is unaffiliated. That is now the predominant plurality of voters in North Carolina is unaffiliated voters. And so be very interesting to see again how this continues to play out in trend lines and things like that. But let's talk a little bit in the last few minutes of our time together. What's going on with some state races? Unless you've been under a rock recently, um, um, you know that Mark Robinson is in some real trouble in terms of his ability to eke out a victory on election day. This is another one where, barring some sort of huge October surprise, and we may have had a minor one yesterday when Robinson made an announcement, but for those who may not know what I'm talking um, about 3 or 4 weeks ago, a CNN story broke. Basically, they learned that Lieutenant Governor Robinson, many years ago, before he was in public office, but still many years ago, made a series of really just unbelievably awful comments online on a pornographic website and in other places, compared himself or called himself a black Nazi or a black Hitler, uh, uh, made just some wild and bizarre sexual comments. And what's been interesting is in the wake of that CNN report, almost all of Robinson's campaign staff have resigned. The Republican Governors Association pulled all of their media buys for Robinson on September 24th. So Robinson essentially has no commercials left on the air. Republicans, I think, are deeply concerned about the down ballot effect on other GOP candidates because of this scandal. Stein already had a pretty comfortable lead. He's Josh Stein's the current Attorney General, pretty comfortable lead heading into that announcement. It has just exploded into a 16-point moving polling average margin right now. I do think that historically, if history is any guide, this race might tighten up a little bit between now and election day. I don't know what the announcement yesterday that Robinson has decided to sue CNN. He announced that yesterday. I think that was the timing on that's a little suspect because basically the deadline for CNN to respond to that lawsuit is now they timed this specifically so that deadline is after election day. So I think yesterday was my assessment of that. It's a little more cosmetic and public relations than an actual serious lawsuit. There's not very many people, I think, in political circles in North Carolina that doubt the veracity of the CNN report. It was pretty well researched, pretty well documented. And Robinson, at least up to this point, has done a really, quite frankly, lousy job of responding to those allegations. But again, talking about down ballot races, some other races to watch. We've got a lot of open seat races near the top of the ballot. Lieutenant governor, and what you're going to see in these races is interestingly a pretty sizable fundraising advantage for the Democrats in these races. State Senator Rachel Hunt is running against former Lieutenant Governor Chief of Staff Hal Weatherman. Weatherman worked for not Lieutenant Governor Robinson, but his predecessor, Dan Forrest. In the Attorney General's race, which is probably shaping up to be the most competitive race of the Council of State races, that's going to be a big one. Two congressmen are stepping down from their seats to run against each other. Jeff Jackson from Mecklenburg and Dan Bishop from just outside Mecklenburg. But again, going to be a very expensive, probably very tight race there. For North Carolina Treasurer, State Representative Wesley Harris is running against Brad Briner. Briner is a investment counselor and most notably worked recently for Michael Bloomberg, handling his investment portfolio. And then in the state auditor's race, I don't necessarily call this one an open seat because technically Jessica Holmes is the incumbent state auditor right now, but she was not elected to that position. She was appointed to that position after Beth Wood resigned following a scandal last year. She's opposed by Dave Bolliak, who some of you may know as a member of the North Carolina or University of North Carolina Board of Trustees. Talking about the General Assembly real quick.
Hey, Robert, can we answer a question real quick? Because I know we're coming to time.
Please.
So we have a question in here that you might know or you might not know, but how is the state supporting Western NC to provide voting legislation to transportation, etc., given that there's some, they might weigh one way or the other when it comes to party affiliation?
Great question. Great question. The State Board of Election took action a couple of weeks ago now to give a wide range of emergency powers to the county boards of election in the counties that were in the disaster area, the ability to adjust polling locations, polling hours, giving extra assistance in terms of the delivery and collection of absentee ballots. And what's been interesting about that, I think, is that those efforts have been praised widely by both Democrats and Republicans for the extent to which the State Board of Election has granted that broad latitude. And I think I don't know if there will be additional measures considered between now and Election Day, but I think the big takeaway there is that trying to give those county boards of elections in those disaster counties that wide latitude.
Right. Thank you.
Sure. So bringing things home here real quick, in the Senate, 50 seats in the Senate. Republicans enjoy a supermajority control. That is, they have enough votes to override a gubernatorial veto. Republicans enjoy that both the House and the Senate. I don't think there's any question that Republicans are going to retain control of the Senate and the House in North Carolina. The question is, will they retain their supermajorities? So we've got 8 competitive seats in the Senate that we're watching, 19 competitive races over in the House. Those will be interesting things to watch. Again, I think the big one is going to be this kind of purple district down here in Mecklenburg. That's Tricia Cotham, who was the party switcher. She switched from Democrat to Republican that gave Republicans that veto-proof majority. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We were going to talk a little bit about some state advocacy priorities and state emerging issues, but with our one remaining minute, what I would like to do is plug a survey that NCACPA is launching or has launched on alternative pathways to CPA licensure. I would encourage you to whip out your phones, take that survey by using that QR code on the screen. I think this is going to be a big issue for North Carolina and for other states around the country as we consider things like license mobility and the possibility of broadening the ways that an individual can become a CPA, what those education and experience and exam questions exam requirements rather look like. So please take like I said, take a second, snap a photo or use that link in the QR code and please respond to that survey. Unfortunately, that's all the time we had for today. But if you have follow-up questions, I would encourage you email myself, email Iris. We'd be happy to answer those questions. And again, thank you for your participation today. Iris?
That's it. Thank you, guys. We appreciate your time.
All right. Thanks, and have a great rest of your week. And don't forget to vote.